I mean, in the context of the South African economy, the climate finance is really more than that.
Okay.
It's both the kind of mitigating against our existing electricity system that's based on coal and moving to renewables, but also ensuring that there is a transition for workers and communities that have formed around those existing systems of coal-based electricity generation, and that they have a future.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mobilize podcast. My name's David Lytle, and today I'm hosting Joan Stott from IEJ. With all that said, do you want to introduce yourself, Joan?
Sure. Thanks, David. So I'm Joan Stott, and I work with the Institute for Economic Justice. The Institute is an economic think tank that started in about 2018, and it was really to fill the gap in kind of economic policy, kind of research and issues around resourcing and addressing some of the challenges that South Africa faces. My role at the Institute is Senior Program Officer for Climate Finance and Resource Mobilization, and I oversee the team that works on international financial institutions, tax, budget advocacy, and then of course, climate finance in my role. But some of the other teams are also working on climate issues specifically and energy transition issues specifically.
Cool. So, and let's just start to unpack that because it's a lot.
It is a lot.
And what IEJ does, right, is you're basically, you're the policy people. You sort of work out, when we say this policy isn't working, it's not benefiting people, you're providing the alternative policy, which can then be advocated for and supported
Correct.
by the rest of society. And then I imagine in this context, we're talking particularly about climate finance.
Yes.
Which I imagine the typical listener is now probably aware of what that is. But should we dive into that a little bit? And do you want to give me a quick insight into how would you define what climate finance is?
Sure. So, I mean, there is the kind of universal global term around climate finance that it has to do with the adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage, all those big words that get thrown around at the big conference of party meetings that happen twice a year.
Conference of party meetings?
Yes, so that's what is commonly referred to as COP.
Okay, so everyone has heard of the COP, like climate, what's it, Conference of Parties.
Yes.
And that was where like the Paris Agreement took place.
Yeah, in 2015.
Last year was Baku, for those who follow this at all.
Yes, and then this year will be in Belém in Brazil, and it'll be the 30th Conference of the Parties meeting, so COP 30.
It's been going for a bit now.
It has.
And then as a quick sort of, you mentioned, instead of the normal adaptation mitigation. For our viewers that don't know what we mean by adaptation and mitigation, do you want to quickly outline the difference?
So adaptation is usually finance that's directing to adjust to a new climate future. So let's say we have like a drier season because we don't get as much rainfall. Any financing that is put towards altering agrarian kind of production or transport or infrastructure to address that situation, because of course you can also have more floods rather than a drought season. So that would be adaptation based finance. And then mitigation is really addressing your current carbon emissions. So carbon is released into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels like coal to get electricity in South Africa. And that is increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is causing more and more climate events to occur.
Okay. So if we put it that one line, mitigation is stop polluting.
Yes.
Stop putting the carbon.
So it's moving from one system to another. So,
Coal to solar, coal to wind. And adaptation is flood walls. It's bigger dams to hold more water for dry seasons. It's that sort of thing. Cool. Okay. So now we have a decent idea of when we're saying we need to mitigate against this, we need to adapt to the issues. And I think it's relatively obvious what finance is in that context, and that we need to pay for it. Now, someone has to pay to build the walls, the seawalls. Someone has to pay to build the dam. Someone has to pay to put in wind and solar and any other solutions that we need. So when you say climate finance, what you were saying is it refers to all of that in totality, right?
Yeah. But I mean, in the context of the South African economy, the climate finance is really more than that.
Okay.
It's both the kind of mitigating against our existing electricity system that's based on coal and moving to renewables, but also ensuring that there is a transition for workers and communities that have formed around those existing systems of coal-based electricity generation, and that they have a future in a new kind of environment.
Yeah. So this is the transition part of it, right? And
Yeah.
the just transition. I know in spaces we've worked, there's often a conversation about, well, what makes it a just transition? Because right now, is it just? And I think that you said the financing is about the financing is about the adaptation mitigation, but also about making it just.
Yes.
And so far, how are we doing on the just side of the transition, would you say?
I wouldn't say we're doing very well.
Okay.
Basically, I mean, there is that very well-known story of the Komati,
Wood, yeah.
who where the community was basically left desolate when they closed the power plant.
And fascinatingly, that wasn't necessarily linked to
No.
CO2 emissions. They were closing that plant because it was an old plant. So Komati Power Station, which is in Mpumalanga, they were closing it basically because it's an old and efficient power plant.
Yeah.
But this whole town basically existed off the workers that worked at the power plant.
Yeah.
I know there's been lots of interventions from other organizations. I know Groundwork has done a lot of work in the area and other organizations. In terms of what sort of happened there, has there been improvement in the last year or so? Or is it still basically just, unfortunately, a bad example of...
Yeah, I have to say that I haven't followed it too closely, but my sense from kind of the other civil society organizations that I've spoken to is that there hasn't been a kind of even a return to what life was when the power station existed. They've been very small and irregular interventions, but nothing that's really given
Nothing
the
systemic.
or sustainable.
So I suppose this speaks to two parts of the financing, right? One is how you actually spend the money, which, in my understanding, that's not your focus. Your focus is more on where do we get the money from?
Yes.
Now, I assume people might imagine, well, you get the money from the new power plant instead, the wind farm or the solar farm, or government pays for it. But it's not quite that simple.
No, definitely not. Especially with the Just Energy Transition Partnership Agreement that's currently in place.
Do you want to just define what that is for everyone very quickly?
So at COP26, there was an idea to form a partnership with South Africa and a few other countries to assist them in moving from a coal-based energy system to a renewable energy system and transition away from this fossil fuel-based economy. So the International Partnership Group, which is made up of the UK, the US, France, the EU, a couple of other big countries, they said they would work with South Africa to help finance the transition.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we've only received 12.6 billion, I think, through these partners.
Rand?
But it's
Rand.
dollars.
Is dollars not the full amount? Isn't 12.6 the full dollar amount?
Yes.
So we received 12.6
billion.
Rand. Oh, you're talking about the commitments? Sorry, you're talking about
Yes,
the
the
commitments?
commitments.
Okay, sorry.
Yes. So okay, let me see.
Yeah, we can go back
Track
there.
of thought.
Sorry.
That's fine. So we've received this $12.6 billion, but it's mainly debt-based.
So when you say it's mainly debt-based, what does that mean?
It means that the South African government and eventually the taxpayer has to pay this money back.
So it doesn't actually mean it's being paid for by Europe or
No.
global north countries. But but a portion of it is, right? A portion are grants, but that's less than 10%.
Yes, it's less than 10% of that.
So if I'm understanding then, in this program, it was encouraged by them, right? They wanted South Africa to produce, they wanted us to turn off our coal power plants and instead move to renewables, which
Yes.
I think anyone who's a climate activist kind of knows why that's important.
Yeah.
And also just an environmental activist and the health and safety that goes with
Yes.
fossil fuel energy. But part of the reason we're doing it now and in the way we are is because the global north wants us to.
Yes,
But they still want us to pay for it.
exactly.
I know that one of the conversations that comes up about this is almost like a historical colonial relationship. I to some degree with South Africa, but it's also more broadly global South countries. And one of the things talked about is that this isn't a form of paying back for that colonial stuff. But if it's debt, is it?
So, I mean, I wouldn't put it exactly the way that you've put it in terms of like, paying back for the colonial, let's say, implementations that happened when we were under colonial rule. I would say it's more a continuation of a colonial or imperialist relationship with the countries.
Okay.
That they still exert power over us, and part of this problem that we have with the debt is not only that we have to pay for it, but that it includes conditionalities around policy change.
When you say conditionality around policy change, what do you mean?
So that they actually are influencing how South Africa's government determines economic policy.
When you say economic policy, do you want to give an example? Or?
I'm trying to think now of so it's got to do with like how we finance infrastructure, how we build infrastructure, how we implement austerity in our budget, like what parts of social services do we cut so that our debt path doesn't grow too much.
Okay, so what we're describing here is not just $12.6 billion for building power plants and flood defenses and stuff. It's also $12.6 billion, but you need to change your taxation policy to align with us. You need to stop spending on healthcare. You need to... So I see what you're saying about it's really... I know sometimes it's been presented as sort of a decolonial or a reparative transaction, but it's actually just...
It's another form of control.
Yeah, very similar to sort of like IMF or World Bank loans. It's the same sort of idea.
Exactly.
So I think we're beginning to see what the obvious problem is. I know other organizations, when they talk about those sort of requirements, also are uncomfortable that it's quite dictatorial in terms of what interventions we do. Like I know a lot of the funding is predisposed on the idea that we invest in export green hydrogen.
Yeah.
So I suppose, then you guys developed the alternative policy, right? So what is that?
Yes.
What is this alternative policy you guys are working on, and what does it say about this?
So, we were very happy initially to just comment on the Just Energy Transition Partnership plan, but then we thought, no, well, actually our space in this kind of community and civil society is to provide these alternatives, as you mentioned. So through a process of working with our partners at COSATU and some academic institutions, we developed 3 papers.
Yeah.
There is a 4th one that's on the way, which I'll speak to, but the first one was using fiscal policy, another one on using monetary policy.
Let's pause there.
Okay.
What is fiscal policy
so
specifically?
Fiscal policy is taking your domestic and global economic circumstances, looking at how much tax you can raise, how much expenditure you need to have for the government to fulfill its basic services, provide roads, that sort of thing. And then you, of course, take your expenditure away from your tax, and the balance needs to be funded through debt. So debt management.
So it's the budget.
Yeah, it's the budget.
Okay, so fiscal policy is the budget policy.
Yeah.
Monetary policy?
Monetary policy in South Africa is determined by the National Treasury, which is our Ministry of Finance, and it is given to the South African Reserve Bank to implement. We currently have a policy of inflation targeting, which means that we maintain prices in the economy by using interest rates to meter inflation, which is the increase of prices over time.
So with monetary policy, it's basically it's controlling inflation. It's the amount of
money supply and
the amount of money we print.
Yes.
So effectively, the Reserve Bank's printing more rands every single day, and they don't want to print. They want to print an amount so as not to devalue it beyond the target that they're setting, because inflation is a slow devaluation of a currency.
Yeah.
Okay. You were going to say some more policies.
Some more policies. So the third one is on development finance institutions, which, for what we said about the IMF and World Bank, there is some value in what they do, but really for South Africa, we're looking to our national development banks, which is like the Industrial Development Corporation, better known as the IDC, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is the DBSA, which are 2 main development banks, which are really there to fill the gap between what government won't fund, but the private sector feels is too risky to fund, but needs funding to provide a social service to the economy. So the Development Finance Institution paper really looks at how the IDC in particular is failing in its mandate. It's not really funding the things that will further the just transition. It's funding things over a very short period of time. It's not providing debt to small enterprises that are really below what they would receive in the market. And also one of the big issues we picked up is that the board of the IDC is actually very much based in this mining and private finance complex. So, it's very representative of private financial institutions and the mining industry. Some people on the board have been there in excess of 13 years. There is a trade union representative who I believe is left now. But we really are asking for better representation and also for further capitalization from the government so that the IDC can really fulfill this mandate around filling the gap between what the private sector won't fund and what government is able to fund.
Okay. So is the focus then pretty much on IDC and not on the international funders and the work you guys are doing? Or is it sort of across all?
So the premise for most of our work in this kind of alternative financing mechanisms is around the idea that just as climate can be considered a public good, so a public good is like non-rivaled, you can't substitute the climate for something else as a consumer, and it's non-excludable. I can't prevent you from experiencing the climate through some mechanism. So that's why we say it's a public good. And public goods in general should be provided by government. The just transition is also going to be a public good.
Okay. Well, I think that's an interesting point. So a lot of the conversation's about money. But there's huge benefits to a transition beyond just the financial, but can translate into finance, right? So what I'm thinking of here is the way coal power plants pollute really dramatically.
Yes.
So if we have a switch away from coal, we have less medical bills. We have more productive workers. So I suppose this is when getting into the IDC's purpose in terms of growing the economy, building opportunity, beyond the fact that renewable energy is now cost competitive, if not better than traditional fossil fuels. It actually has all these knock-on effects in our economy, which are not as easy to attribute unless you really look into it.
Exactly.
So in terms of the policy work, you're sort of focusing on that. What is sort of the takeaways you've been getting so far? What are sort of the reactions, those sort of things?
So we haven't really officially launched those papers.
Okay.
They're on our website. They're available for the public to read. But what the main work that I've been focusing on is bringing all of them together into one framework document, which we will be launching at the end of August. And that is really what we're going to be taking to NEDLAC, to the PCC. So it's really kind of like a handbook for anyone who's interested. To kind of like, okay, no, we want to advocate for an increase in the carbon tax.
Okay.
Or we want to advocate that part of the fuel levy goes towards financing a climate response fund. Or we feel that the Reserve Bank should implement greater regulations around financial institutions kind of disclosing how much they invest in fossil fuel industries versus clean industries.
Yeah.
And then that would then determine their interest rate or the credit that they're allocated in their financing agreements. So really it's a whole system of kind of like re-looking at the economy and rethinking of how we can leverage these institutions to finance a future that is socially just and worker-centered and low carbon emissions.
So sort of dealing with all the problems we're facing at once.
Yes.
It
might be my life's work.
It doesn't sound like the worst life work to be doing.
It's not just a year program.
No, not just 1 year. And it sounds like you're still very much in the early stages where you're basically just creating the background material,
Yes.
which is used in the advocacy later.
Yeah.
What are sort of so how much are you looking at advocacy already in terms of the work? Are you already in sort of the mode to switch in terms of getting activists involved? Yeah. And you talked about working with COSATU, so
Yes.
the trade union movement as well.
So for the remainder of this year, we're going to be, with COSATU, we're going to be running 2 provincial workshops with their membership. And then we're also, as I said, going to be looking at NEDLAC and the PCC. But we're also thinking of kind of how can we pair this with some of the other work that the IEJ has done, like on climate responsive budgeting or gender responsive budgeting, food systems, the climate finance toolkit that we did last year. So really that it becomes a very integrated work plan, and that we can leverage off different aspects of the work, because also one of our teams works is very focused on a universal basic income grant, which is kind of a core issue in transitioning workers who have been based around a coal-fired power station to a new kind of livelihood.
Could you unpack that a bit more about the universal basic income grant and how it relates?
Sure. So, we believe that not all the workers would be skilled to immediately move from working at a coal-fired power station to, let's say, a solar farm. Or they might not want to move to a solar farm because it's not in the same area, but they want to develop ability to work maybe on a farm or
change their careers
somewhere. A universal basic income grant, so basically an extension of the social relief for distress grant, would allow them to do that. So at the moment, there's not a kind of avenue for them to supplement their income.
So I suppose the first question that comes to mind is just the scale that we're talking about here, right? So if we think of, in the coal industry, if we think of the power plant workers plus the miners, I imagine the miners are a lot more vulnerable than the people working in the power plant, because those are typically more technically trained individuals. But what the coal miners earn versus what the social relief of distress grant is, it's not really a comparable money at all. It's more than an order of magnitude difference. So is this sort of as a part of a broader solution, or is it just one component, or what's the sort of thinking here?
It's just one component at this stage. I imagine because we're fighting quite a big battle on the universal basic income grant at the moment. We won the court case against the government, but now that is in appeal.
Lawfare takes a long time.
Yes. So, it's kind of like working at 2 streams at the same time. And part of the climate response fund that we speak to in the fiscal policy paper, I imagine, could go towards supporting miners who are transitioning from a coal mine. We haven't really fleshed out those details. But the argument by the government at the moment is that we don't have money to continue to sustain the SRD grant. But the fiscal policy says, well, here's a whole lot of money, up to 100 billion a year, we've calculated. So you can use some of that to transition workers.
I think that's interesting as well. We've been having, with some of the other podcasts we've spoken to Open Secrets and some journalists. And one of the interesting things are Open Secrets recently released a report on basically how a lot of this, ostensibly this debt we're incurring, is actually going to consultants, many of which are not even South African. And I remember one of the things we talked about is I think in South Africa there's somewhere like 30, 40,000 coal miners in the country, in that sort of range.
I'm not 100%.
Yeah,
I'll trust you on that.
Well, I'll have to double check, and if we're off the mark here, we'll do a quick edit of the video.
Yes.
But it's tens of thousands of coal workers, and the amount of money that's being spent on consultants to work out a plan on how to look after them could literally just be used for like early pensions potentially.
In all likelihood.
So it's an interesting one, because particularly with this part of the justice transition, there's other elements, right? It's not as simple as that, but it's not like there's actually a money problem there. It's actually more of a, like you said, it's the policy. It's how we use the money, how we've chosen to deploy it. I imagine the loans being earmarked, that when the loans get earmarked by the international donors, they're not like, give it to as pensions to former coal miners as a thank you for their service. It's probably more like, well, build a green hydrogen plant here and build a pipeline.
Farm or...
Which And I think one of the things, right, if I imagine with what you're talking about, like if we create that financial room, that will create thousands of small businesses all around the country.
For sure.
Because those individuals won't typically take their money and just sort of walk away with it. It's much more... I don't know. Do you guys do research into how people use that kind of money?
So I think our Universal Basic Income Grant team has done some work as part of kind of their motivation for why it's a good thing to have the SRD continue.
Yes. Social relief of distress grant.
Yeah. Sorry, I did say it out in full first. But
Can never be too careful.
No. So I think they've done some work on kind of like calculating what benefit it brings to people's lives. So, for instance, I know there's some statistic around that they could, just by having that small amount of income, they were able to like look for 10 more jobs because they weren't so worried about how they were going to feed their families that evening.
Okay, so it's either that, or I've definitely heard stories as well of people starting small businesses. So, but long story short, it's actually quite a investment in a sense.
Yeah.
It won't just end up with that money going to people. They themselves could potentially be involved in building the new infrastructure.
Yes.
That comes with a transitioned economy. So I got a sense from you that one of the barriers is current policy around how the IDC functions and other state-owned or state-affiliated investment programs. And obviously there's this other issue of the restrictions placed in the what did you call them?
The policy conditionality.
The conditionality placed on these international loans and grants. So what's the fix? Like what's if let's say there's an activist and we're not even talking about what they do yet, but just to understand this problem,
Yes.
What is the like clear and obvious fixes? What are the things we need to ask for?
So there are a few things. My colleague who works on the international financial institutions, their main focus is getting parliamentary sign-off on any loans that the government takes on. At the moment, the National Treasury can sign off. They don't need to take it to Parliament. So we're asking for greater transparency and accountability through our parliamentary structures. And this would kind of feed through the system. So even if the loan was specifically for the just energy transition, like it would still have to go to Parliament. And in that way, then the taxpayer is actually more aware of the burden being placed on them and their future kind of children or grandchildren to pay off that loan. Also, there would be more awareness around what it means for our policy sovereignty and how we determine economic policy in the country. And then I think the other fix is around understanding that these loans are just creating more debt. It's not actually money that's being given to us, as you mentioned earlier. And the over-reliance on private sector funding through these kind of blended finance and de-risking models.
Oof, there's a whole entire topic.
I know. Could have a whole nother podcast on that.
Exactly.
Because a lot of the implementation plan for the just energy transition relies heavily on the private sector stepping in. But that is just another form of debt that government will likely have to pay back. The private sector will also want to maximize profits. So as well as recouping the cost through the debt mechanism, they will in all likelihood implement user costs, which government may or may not subsidize, but ultimately consumers and government is going to pay.
So the fix. What is the fix?
The fix is, mobilizing our existing financial resources and fiscal policy.
Okay.
As I mentioned, the carbon tax, because there have been so many leniencies and kind of write-offs or dispensations against the existing carbon tax. I think the effective rate we worked out is R7 per ton.
Okay.
That companies are paying. So even though the carbon tax covers 90% of industries that are emitting carbon.
Is it currently covering Eskom?
I'm not entirely sure on that.
Because I know
detail.
they've been exempted a lot from those sort of things.
Well, if it's not covering it, it should.
Okay.
But we're already paying their debts.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure
we absorb it anyway. It sort of just goes through the system.
I'm not sure whether putting a carbon tax on Eskom is going to
So-
really...
So if I'm understanding you, the fix is actually to say the things that are bad, that are not helping our economy and are poisoning us, i.e. these, and causing climate change, we tax that, and we take that tax revenue and we spend it on things that fix the problem.
Yes.
And that's the core of it.
Yeah.
And I imagine this is also when you talk about international financial architecture, this can be applied globally. So we were talking about how the current system is quite colonial, but it can be different, right?
Yes.
I assume there's also an advocacy position here around talking with our partners in the global north. And when I say partners, I mean other organizations working there about actually not just loans, grants that can be used to amplify the work we're doing locally.
Yes.
Cheapers. And I suppose we can get into a whole conversation about international tax agreements and stuff as
Yeah.
well. But okay,
It's a whole another aspect of the portfolio I look after.
But I suppose really what it comes down to is we need to take money from the people who are inappropriately benefiting from harming our environment, harming our people, harming the world around us, and use that money to make a better world.
Exactly. Because it's not the reason why we can't raise what used to be the 100 billion every year, which is now like 300 billion every year for the climate agreement. It's not because the money isn't there. It's because there's no incentive for people who hold the money to kind of pass it on.
It's really interesting because I think what this shows is the connection between different issues, right? Because I think someone would go, oh, well, I'm a climate activist. But they wouldn't necessarily think about how they're actually a financial architecture activist.
Yes, or a sustainable development goal activist.
There we go. So it's actually that these things are all intersectional with one another.
Yes.
And maybe a takeaway for activists watching this or listening to this is if you are involved in one component, maybe you don't have to be an advocate for a different component, but at least understanding the interrelationships so that in some way you're an ally.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because as you said earlier, by kind of addressing the coal-fired power station, you mitigate future health problems that those communities might face.
Yeah.
With cleaner air, less exposure to
heavy metals,
that sort of thing.
Cleaner water.
So in actual fact, like climate finance does not lie separate from the sustainable development goals for education and health and everything else that it covers. It doesn't lie separate from a universal healthcare system or universal basic income grant. It's all kind of related because as we move to this new future where the environment's going to be different, the weather's going to be different, there's going to be more digitization. Like it all feeds into the same story of how do we make the future beneficial and sustainable and inclusive for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I think it's a lot for us to sort of dwell on, and I think we'll make sure we link some of these.
Yeah.
Make sure after this, I think send us some of those links that we can put in the description. On the various social media platforms. If there's one last thing for folks to take away, what can they do to interact with IEJ's work on this a bit more?
Well, certainly you can sign up to our newsletter.
Okay.
But also just kind of think about how everything is interconnected. And when we put out something on budget advocacy, it's actually forming a foundation for financing the just transition.
Okay.
When we talk about food systems or climate responsive budgeting, it doesn't lie separate from our work on universal basic income grant or critical minerals or even our work in the G20, because all of this, as you said, has a national focus, but can be replicated on an international basis.
Why did you mention the G20? Now I want to ask another 15 questions.
You can cut that.
But yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I think that big thing is it's maybe collaborating with IEJ. So if you're involved in another organization, I know IEJ works with, is a very collaborative organization.
Yes.
So i.e. if you're running a small community-based organization or a bigger NPO, maybe reach out to IEJ to see if you guys can do some training for them and help them understand the pathways. And then for just general activists, amplify their work, guys.
Yeah, and we've got that great
the
resource, the Climate Finance Toolkit, which will familiarize you with all the terminology.
And I think these things are getting better as well. So, there's lots of ways to engage on this. But yeah. Thank you so much, Joan. I think we've run out of time, but thanks for joining us today.
We only just scraped the surface.
Oh, I guess we're going to have some more later. But
yes.
But it was great having you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great being here.
Thanks for watching this Mobilize podcast. Remember to follow, subscribe, like, and comment.